Hey guys, so last time I talked about the Aleutian Islands, which was a lesser known campaign during World War II when Japan attacked Alaska. So remember when I said that from 1941 to 1945 that Japan would go on to attack US soil several times? Well, the Aleutian Islands was only one of those times. These other attacks were mostly focused on the United States west coast, and they were, how should I put it, less than successful. Let's go through them, shall we?
Number 1. The bombardment of Estevan Point Lighthouse. On June 20, 1942, the Japanese submarine I-26, under the command of Yokota Minoru, fired 25 to 30 rounds of 5.5-inch shells at the Estevan Point Lighthouse on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. After the attack, the submarine went back to Japan. It failed to hit its target. There was no damage and no casualties. Number 2. The bombardment of Fort Stevens. The bombardment of Fort Stevens was notable in that it was the only attack on a mainland American military installation during World War II. The Japanese submarine I-25, under the command of Tagami Meiji, surfaced near the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon on the night of June 21st and 22nd in 1942. It fired shells toward Fort Stevens, which was a Civil War-era U.S. Army fort. The extent of the damage was so insignificant that the military personnel at Fort Stevens didn't even fire back. The only damage officially recorded was to a baseball field's backstop and some telephone cables. Number 3. The Lookout Air Raids. On September 9th, 1942, a Japanese submarine under control of Tagami Meiji,
Yeah, the same guy behind the success of the bombardment of Fort Stevens,
surfaced just west of Cape Blanco in Oregon. The submarine launched a single Glenn Yokosuka E-14Y floatplane, flown by Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita and Petty Officer Okuda Shoji. The plane dropped 2 incendiary bombs near Brookings, Oregon, with the intent to start a forest fire. While a small fire did start, it was kept under control by 2 men. These 2 fire lookouts, Howard Raz Gardner and Keith V. Johnson, were able to contain the fires caused by the incendiary bombs throughout the night until a fire crew arrived.
Also, I'm guessing that Tagami Meiji wasn't super familiar with the climate of Western Oregon because it's like always raining over there.
Because it had actually rained on that fateful day, it was one of the main reasons why the fires didn't cause as much damage as it could have. Interestingly, this was only the second time ever that the contiguous United States was bombed by an enemy aircraft.
Now I'm gonna go off topic just a bit. Here's a brief history.
The year was 1920. The Mexican Revolution had ended and the president, Porfirio Diaz, was ousted from power. The revolutionaries elected a president, Francisco Madero, to replace Diaz, who ruled since 1884. This caused huge instability in the government of Mexico. Following this revolution, there was a series of rebellions against Mexican government, and it was just a mess. 9 years and 11 presidents later, the Escobar Rebellion was raging between government forces led by President Emilio Portes Gil and rebel forces led by Jose Gonzalo Escobar. Skirmishes were fought near the US-Mexico border. Several of these battles were in the air, which was the first time aircraft was used for battle on the American continent. There weren't a ton of Mexican pilots, so both sides had to resort to hiring pilots from other countries. The government forces hired combat veterans of World War I, such as Royal Air Force pilot Major Rayma L. Andrews. Escobar also hired several pilots, including one Irishman, Patrick Murphy, who accidentally dropped a bomb in an American town, Naco, Arizona, instead of his target, Naco, Sonora, a Mexican town. Both towns straddle the US-Mexico border, resulting in injuries for a bunch of civilians, despite the fact that the US wasn't involved with the Escobar Rebellion in any way.
Yeah, so people would just sit back and watch the battles go down. For fun, I guess. And Murphy never suffered any consequences for accidentally bombing a town. How times have changed. Now back to World War II.
Looking on the bright side, the Lookout Air Raids had a happy ending. 20 years later, the pilot Nobuo Fujita was invited back to Brookings to celebrate a local festival with them. He presented his family's 400-year-old samurai sword to the city as a symbol of his regret and visited many more times as an ambassador of peace and friendship. President Ronald Reagan commended Fujita for his kindness and generosity. Fujita was made an honorary citizen of Brookings, Oregon.
Nobuo Fujita paid other visits to Brookings before dying in 1997 at the age of 85.
Number 4. The bombardment of Elwood. It was 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942. Under the command of Kozo Nishino, a Japanese I-17 submarine arrived at the Elwood oil field, located in Santa Barbara, California. 15 minutes later, Nishino took aim at some fuel tanks and opened fire. There was only superficial damage, and all the oil field workers had already gone home by that time, except for a man only known as G. Brown, who promptly called the cops on the submarine.
I mean, what are you supposed to do when a Japanese submarine shows up in your neighborhood?
Call the police! 911, what's your emergency?
The submarine kept firing into the darkness, but missed nearly every shot. 20 minutes later, it took off. The only damage that occurred was an oil derrick, a pump house, and a catwalk, estimated at about $500 worth of damage. And the best part of all this is that as the submarine left, Nishino reportedly radioed Tokyo to tell them that he, and I quote, left Santa Barbara in flames. Now, this would have been hilarious if it wasn't for the fact that this attack was one of the factors that led to a widespread scare and anti-Japanese sentiments all around the United States, including influencing the president's decision to enact Japanese internment camps. Finally, probably the most well-known attack was a fugo, or fire balloon, bomb. The fugo was essentially a hydrogen balloon with bombs attached. The balloons took advantage of the Earth's natural jet streams, well before we even knew what jet streams were really. Basically, jet streams are really fast and narrow winds that flow in very specific patterns around the Earth, and you have to be really, really high to even use them. A Japanese meteorologist, Wasaburo Oishi, first discovered these jet streams back in the 1920s around Mount Fuji while observing pilot balloons, which are used to determine the speed and directions of winds in higher altitudes. Thanks to these observations, the Japanese government was able to create these fire balloons. The balloons activated their payload with a rudimentary timer using sandbags to keep it afloat every time it descended. After each of the sandbags are released, the bombs would drop as well. They would be launched all the way from Japan in hopes that by the time all the sandbags are dropped, fingers crossed, it would be somewhere on the United States West Coast.
Now, you might be thinking that this is a very crude and inefficient way to activate a bomb, and you'd be right. They were pretty useless. But it was notable in that it was the first ever intercontinental weapon ever used in history.
Japan launched 9,000 of these balloons, and only one of them had any casualties at all. This occurred on May 5th, 1945, in a forest near the city of Bly, Oregon. A local church group was there getting ready to have a picnic when the pastor's pregnant wife and 5 Sunday school children took a quick stroll. This is when they had found a strange balloon in the forest, and you probably guessed it, it was a fire balloon with its payload still intact. It's unknown what exactly happened next, but somehow the bombs were activated, and the pastor's wife and the 5 Sunday school children were killed. This was clearly a fear tactic that the Japanese used against the American public, but the government decided not to tell anyone, and media blackout was enforced by the Office of Censorship. This was done not only to prevent the widespread panic that would inevitably follow, but it also dissuaded the Japanese from sending over more balloons after they heard that none of their attempts succeeded. It was also suspected that if locations and coordinates were made public, the Japanese would be able to use that information while calculating their trajectories in order to make corrections and make the balloons more accurate. What surprises me the most is that after all of these attempts to attack the mainland United States, this was the only time it resulted in any deaths, which is kind of miraculous if you think about it. Interestingly, remains of balloon bombs continued to be found throughout the 40s and even during following years. Most recently, a balloon bomb with a live payload was found in British Columbia in October of 2014. Thankfully, the war ended in August 1945 before more deaths ensued, because more attacks on the American mainland were definitely already in the works, including an intercontinental bomber known as Project Z and Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, which was a biological weapon created by the infamous Biological and Chemical Research Unit 731. They intended to target civilians in San Diego. This attack was scheduled in September, only a month after the Japanese had surrendered.
Thankfully, that's it. Those are all of the times the US mainland was attacked by Japan during the war. I hope you learned as much stuff watching this video as I did when I was researching it. If you did, hit the like button and leave a comment. If you want to see more interesting content, hit the subscribe button. And I'll see you guys next time. And remember, all warfare is based on deception.